A very warm welcome to everyone, and thank you all for joining us in the panel discussion on valuation of natural assets, designing ecological budgets as part of our annual Eastern Himalayan Naturenomics Forum 2021. In this session, we'll discuss the importance of an ecological budget in driving a naturenomics economy needed to achieve a balance between rural and urban communities and invest in rural communities. We also wish to understand how traditional budgeting accounting system can be complemented by an environmental budget in which natural resources are also measured along with the money. We are truly honored to have eminent personalities with us today to share their insights and concerns for the protection of the environment in the Eastern Himalayan region. With this, I would like to introduce the panelists for today. Dr. Lavish Bhandari is an empirical economist, environment evangelist, and entrepreneur, and focuses his attention almost exclusively on improving the environment. He is currently the president of Indicus Foundation and leads its Environment and Sustainable Livelihoods initiative. Lavish has rich published research output to his credit pertaining to sustainable livelihoods, industrial, economic, and social reforms in India, economic geography, and financial inclusion. Iris is an analyst and connector. Iris works on achieving a just and inclusive world and views sustainable agriculture as the crucial link. After her degree in social geography, she started working at Nature Squared. As befits a true geographer, she easily switches between different scale levels and knows how to combine economic, environmental, and social questions. Iris brings valuable international experience and mainly works on delivering projects for for corporate clients with a specific focus on the transformation of supply chains. Paul recently left an academic position directing Oxford University's MSc Biodiversity Conservation and Management to directly work at the intersection of natural asset restoration, finance, and technology. He previously worked for 15 years in Indonesia, running and designing conservation programs, and started his career in local government, working on urban conservation projects in Manchester and Shrewsbury. Paul is passionate about innovation and working with clients to research and co-design new approaches and solutions. He has a doctorate in protected area policy, has co-founded the fields of conservation, biogeography, and conservation culture Romix, and is a member of the Rewilding Europe Advisory Board. Without further delays, I would like to direct the first question to Iris. So, Iris, can the effects of environmentally harmful businesses and carbon-intensive industries be reversed? If so, how can the adoption of policy-driven sustainable financing play a bigger role?
Well, first of all, I think thank you also, Ankit, and thank you to be present also with the other panelists. Nice to see that we're all geographers. I think that really brings us together, really brings us to focus on all these different lenses of environment, society, development, how that's combined. But yeah, can the effects indeed of environmentally harmful businesses actually be reversed? Well, I think most of us can see that we are actually facing a quite gloomy image with also the planetary boundaries. 4 of them have already been crossed, and that includes 4 of the core boundaries, also the boundaries of climate change and biodiversity loss. And indeed, by changing these boundaries, we will arrive in a much less hospitable state for humans in human well-being. We see that for climate change, we do see that for biodiversity loss as well, with around 1 million plant and animal species that we're now threatened to actually lose. But that's all the case, the same for climate change, that the IPC reports that was recently also again released that showed that if we do not change drastically, then we do not make it. Then we do not limit it to the 1.5 or the 2 degrees of global warming. But that to say, it says if we do not drastically change. So instead of thinking, okay, let's lean back, we cannot do anything anymore, I think it's now really time for action. And luckily, we do see that more and more efforts, more and more initiatives are now also facing on, especially climate change, a bit more slowly for biodiversity, but also all these reports that show that, for instance, over half of the world's total GDP is moderately or even highly dependent on nature and its benefits and its services. So also the financial sector is now increasingly looking into, for example, the loss of biodiversity and what kind of risks but also opportunities it could provide if you do manage that relation to nature better, if you do manage that well. So I would hope to also give a bit more of a promising issue, that we do see that there are more initiatives coming up, well, especially on climate, with more and more financial institutions that have set targets that are in line with the climate agreement. We see that for businesses who are setting targets, who are also, for example, the voluntary market for carbon, the price has gone up exponentially. It's going crazy, and that's because there's such a demand to actually mitigate the effects of climate change there. But biodiversity, even though it's a very pressing issue, it's still lagging a bit behind on the agenda. So in the Netherlands, we're a bit more on the front runners when it comes to finance and biodiversity. We do see that there is this increased interest. We see more publications on this. There's a working group as part of the Dutch National Bank to understand biodiversity and the financial sector and the risks and the relations between these two. But we also carried out a survey about a year ago among 13 financial institutions in the Netherlands. And then we actually saw that none of the institutions had a target on biodiversity. And they also didn't really know how to include that in their investment decisions. So data was also often mentioned as a key barrier, which made it difficult them to actually encounter this topic. Climate change is a much easier topic to grasp compared to nature with all its complexity. But at the same time, the good thing is that we do see these learning communities popping up to get a better understanding of what can be done. There are also new initiatives focusing on that accounting for nature, which then makes it easier to actually measure nature. But I think you can also do it in a more qualitative way with the financial sector, really focusing on what are promising sectors that have a positive effect on biodiversity. What are some kind of initiatives and efforts that companies can undertake to have a more positive effect on biodiversity? Think, for instance, about regenerative agriculture or bio-based building materials rather than cement. So I think also, if you look at it more in a qualitative way, really start the engagement with companies to do it in a better way, that we see signs that things are changing also for biodiversity.
Rightly said, Iris. So, in relation to what Iris just said about initiatives being there and the need to take actions, and the initiatives as well as the collectives happening, but they're there on a very individualistic level, like they are existing in silos. So, in that regards, what immediate steps must be taken while designing broader economic policies and trying to integrate natural capital valuation within these economic policies when it comes to a developing economy like India?
Um, so I think you asked a very, I think a question for which hopefully we have a lot of different answers to. The problem is we don't agree with the answers. So that's one this thing. But with that background, let me just try and list out a few. I think what Iris said was really, I mean, sets the base for this discussion quite well, because it is true that we have two massive challenges, and that's also, I mean, we have many challenges, but you can broadly categorize them as climate change and biodiversity. And in both these accounts, we have massive challenges. On both these accounts, we are really underperforming in terms of the actions that governments, individuals, companies, civil society needed to have taken by now. So in that, so given that, the only question that arises is that how do we scale up and how fast do we do it in terms of our actions? And in doing so, we should make sure that we are able to sustain and even improve upon them. So we cannot do what Sri Lanka did, and that's something has been a really important example set for us, that if you do go in unprepared and take some drastic action, we will be forced to reverse it. So I think that's something which a lot of people are only now beginning to understand. Now, having said these, the basic thing, the need for action, how do we structure it, and of course, temporarily, or I mean, when do we do it? We of course can't wait for 30 years. We really don't have the resources to do it within a couple of years, and we don't have the capacities to do it. So, and I think that is where the governments really need to get their act together, and I haven't really seen any country do that. Let us first recognize that the challenges are serious. The challenges are serious not only because of the scale of the problem and the risks involved. The challenges are serious because we are really not prepared to address them. We are not prepared financially, and we definitely do not have the capacities. And especially in the developing world, it is really, really difficult. Uh, Now, the first step that the policy needs to take is to recognize the problem and recognize the weaknesses. We haven't really been doing that. Most of the debate, at least in the global forum, has been, you're not doing enough. Yes, we are trying to do some more. Yeah, you're not doing enough. Yes, we are trying to do more. All of that is correct, but the most important thing is let us first do a very clean accounting of the kind of capacities that we have today and how much are we really investing in building up those capacities. And by capacities, I mean to say that a lot of these actions are going to be taken at the local level. It won't be just a few, let's say, power plants that you need to change. You need to change the whole structure of the DNA of the economy. The state is not prepared for it. They don't have the tools for it. The people are not educated enough. And you give them a lot of objectives to do, uh, you'll have serious problems because those people who are really not trained in the requirements of the job will make a hash of it. So that's one class of issues. I think valuation does get, if we were able to easily value natural resources, then to some extent these problems could have been solved because then a price signal could have affected what otherwise you need to mandate. However, the problem, at least I'm speaking from an Indian perspective, and globally things might be different, it's extremely difficult to value natural resources properly. So if you had one commission, which is, let's say, a national commission, which could value it, it's easier for it to do because it comes under a lot of monitoring. There are a lot of people, there are debates, there are discussions, etc. They get feedback and they can. But if you have one accountant sitting in a firm or in a company in, let's say, not in some of the major cities, it will be very difficult to monitor those actions. So you can very easily have what happened in India in the 1990s when a whole range of teak farms or tree farms were valued, and they were valued at billions of dollars, and all of that was actually just overvaluation. So there are these possibilities that can very easily happen in countries such as India and the developing world as well, where monitoring is not so easy. So what I'm trying to get at is, yes, there are challenges. Yes, we need to act fast. We need to stagger some of the actions, but most importantly, we need to understand what all we have the capacities for, and how do we enhance our own capacities for change.
Thank you for the insights, Dr. Bhandari. So you rightly mentioned about the lack of capacity, especially in a developing economy like India, and then the practices being there but not effective at the ground, like uh, on the local level. So in that context, my next question to you, Paul, is how can businesses and governments get away? I mean, they often get away with greenwashing, right? They use certain terminologies, ambiguous terminologies, to for their projects and the development they have undertaken, but they get away with it easily because they do not have accountability. So how can we ensure that such greenwashing doesn't happen?
Yeah, thanks. And first of all, lovely to be in this. Greetings from Oxford, and some of my happiest days have been bird watching in the Eastern Himalayas. So it's lovely to be part of this discussion. But Ankit, perhaps I could sort of answer your question in some ways in picking up on one of the themes Iris picked up on, the changes in the financial world, and then Lavesh's comments on how to structure action rather and capacity. So I think one of the encouraging developments, we're seeing from the perspective where we are in England and close to the financial centres in London, is the rise of ESG, environment and social governance. And this is a really positive development because it's, in some ways, this, how do you change greenwashing? You might say, well, a lot of it roots back to capital on it. And we are beginning to see encouraging changes in how capital is invested and the owners of capital starting to assign ESG requirements to the investors on this. And related to that, what I find a very exciting development, or hopeful development may be the word there, is that previously a lot of the work has been done on what we call greening finance or greening corporate action. And that's about doing no harm, trying to remove harm from supply chains, zero deforestation and so forth. We're now seeing that there's a progressive action of we want to do no harm, but we want to go beyond that and contribute positively to social agendas, social and environmental agendas. And this is creating this demand. It's sort of something like, we want to be climate neutral, we want to be nature positive. How do we become nature positive? And it's creating a demand for a stake in nature positive projects and initiative. And that stake, we believe, can be assigned a value to it. So this can both draw investments into nature recovery, which is what I'm interested in, but it can also create a new form of accounting. But then I think it comes on to this, this really great point. Lavish made, how do we structure action? Where is the capacity there? And I'm much more of, coming to the view that the capacity is there, it just needs empowering. And one of the things a good way of doing this and maybe connecting it is through investments in innovation. And for instance, the UK or the English government has been very proactive on this. It's actually putting direct investment into grants, competitive grants, to innovate in how to make nature recovery investable. And I really like this. And we've seen this again, Iris, when we're talking about the Netherlands and the change in the management of the Delta, the engineering management of the Delta. That came from a high-level prize for a creative solutions on it. So when we're talking about structuring action, I quite like the idea that actually what government can do, perhaps with the support of financial investors, is to put high-level prizes or high-level innovation grant schemes there, which collectives of talented people, bottom up from wherever, can put together innovative new ideas, which can be discussed, talked about, and create that sort of sense of, this is different ways we can do it, which then governments and other agencies can build upon. And for me, that's I think it's a very effective way of doing things. And then just relating to that, we talked about, both Iris and Laveesh said, biodiversity is coming onto the, if you like, the agenda of the finance world. One of the problems we have with the construct of biodiversity is that it's very closely associated with a protective regime, and it's very closely associated with units of nature, particular types of nature and the right types of nature in place. And this can be a constraining force for innovation because you're currently in this narrative of a nature under threat and we can't innovate with it. Whereas now what we're seeing, and this is part of the rewilding movement, which I'm part of, is this shift or expansion of biodiversity, say, no, actually what we're about is ecosystem recovery. This is the decade of ecosystem recovery. And if we're thinking of recovering nature as a force, we're not trying to create a past nature, we're recovering nature as a force for the future. That really connects with this notion of innovation and innovation with recovering forces of nature to generate value for the economy, for people, and for nature itself. So in summary, I do believe that there is some really interesting developments happening which we can take advantage of, but probably the goal, we just need innovation funding and empowering the talent. I mean, there's huge talent in India, there's huge talent, young talent in the Netherlands and anywhere basically. It's just giving them the space to innovate and that confidence that we can transition to new ways of doing it with the enthusiasms, motivations, capacities we have in our societies.
Yeah, I think we all agree with your views and Dr. Lavish's views on how do we structure the the innovations, especially, how do we structure them in a way that we are able to leverage whatever social capital we have, as well as other environmental and economic capital. But with regards to innovation, Iris, can you throw some light on, like, let's say for the northeastern region and the eastern Himalayan region is rich in natural capital, right? So it becomes a potential business destination for from industries across the globe. How can innovation play a part in that, uh, in the industries coming to the region, so that it does not have an unwarranted effect on the ecology as well as the society?
I think what's most important to really indeed ensure that businesses do not have unwarranted negative effects on ecology and communities is by actually understanding their relation to natural capital better. So we've been doing quite some work with the Capitals Coalition. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Capitals Coalition, but it's an international network, and they're about to mainstream capitals thinking. So really focusing on how to include the value of people, nature, and society in all kinds of decisions. And it's a framework very much focused. It's also a collaborative effort. So it's a framework that takes you along step by step on how to actually understand your relation, how to understand how, for example, a business impacts, but also depends on natural capital, social capital, human capital. But also how to measure and value these impacts and dependencies. So that has been a really good framework actually for businesses to really understand that relation to nature. And by understanding it, you see that, hey, if I do not take, for example, natural capital into account, I could face very important risks. My supply chain, for instance, may become disrupted if my crops don't grow anymore because of a drought. Or for the tourism business, I see that actually natural capital, or the biodiversity hotspots, that's often also where we see the tourists are actually going to as a destination. So there's a very strong dependency also on natural capital for governments, for businesses. So understanding that dependency, understanding that impact, I think is crucial to make different changes, and also to look at nature in a different way, value it in a different way, and therefore also changing business practices to better include and better reflect that value. So we're actually also currently developing an online course for business and organizations all around the world. It's a free course, and that's really about how to understand, to integrate nature, people, and society better across all kinds of business decisions. And I think that is key to really ensure that indeed you do not create these unwarranted risks, because you're better prepared, you better understand these risks, and you're able to turn these risks into opportunities if you do manage that relation well. And we do see, for example, for some sort of innovations you can see in certain sectors. As I said, for example, in the agricultural sector, there's more and more attention now towards more regenerative forms of agriculture, also even going beyond organic agriculture, to focus on all these kinds of things such as water quality, water quantity, soil quality, because they see that if our soils are healthier, we also get a better produce. So this is a sort of practice that we see now in the agricultural field. In the building field, as I said, we see a move towards more bio-based building materials, for example, based on wood. In the tourism, we see more and more demand for more responsible tourism. And I think also, for example, for the Himalayan region, where I think a lot of people that I know who went there go there because of the beauty, because of the beautiful natural region. So therefore, I think that could be a very good business opportunity if you do take into account that relation to nature, if you optimize that, and therefore also attract good business opportunities that provide value to nature and people.
Yeah. Thank you, Iris, for your insights. Dr. Lavish, just continuing with what Iris just mentioned about realizing the relationship that businesses and nature directly have, and the component of natural capital that they are dependent, that the businesses are dependent on heavily. What immediate steps can businesses take, and also the government can take, in strengthening the rural circular economy, especially because when we talk of raw materials, like most of it is in the value chain, the raw materials are sort of brought in from these rural areas, right? So what are the, like, what according to you are a few steps that these businesses can take to realize the relationship and then strengthen it, obviously, for a more comprehensive development?
So let me first start from the government, because I think in most countries the tone is set by the government, and especially if you want to act fast, then it will need to be set by the government, and it need not be a mandate. It can also be a recommendation, a kind of a direction that the government can make to industry. So the first problem is that right now, even within the state, we are not really valuing natural capital. So that the government itself needs to set an example within its decision making. And I can just give you a small example. There's an there was a recent news item where one state refused to cut down 15 trees, and because of that, a dam which could have helped provide some more water or for irrigation to about 1,000 odd farmers could not be built. So just 15 trees were valued to be more than income for, let's say, about 1,000 farmers. Now, a proper valuation here in the hands of the people who were making this decision could have helped them take a more a kind of a better decision, because it's not just about the environment. There is also an equity issue, and most importantly, for a country such as ours, there is an income issue. So I think evaluation works both ways. It helps you take decisions which are a bit more in sync with whatever your objectives are. Otherwise, you are forced to take some extreme decisions, and that's something that we need to guard against, right? Now, having said that, once the government is able to set an example in its actions, then it automatically percolates down to businesses. It's very easy for the businesses to start to emulate what different parts of the state are doing. If the government is not taking actions as per this method, then it becomes very difficult for businesses too, because whether it's the judiciary or people within the government, it's very difficult for them to recognize whether the kinds of valuations or the kind of actions taken by the industry are in sync with what they're supposed to do. So it's very important early on in this for the government to set some sort of a tone, and it need not be a law. I'm really against putting in this habit of putting in very different laws in the environment space. All that you need is a direction. You can show from your own actions, and there are many examples of activities which are happening in the Himalayas right now, where natural capital is being destroyed for economic progress, or so it is believed, right? Now, in none of these projects was an open document ever released that said, okay, fine, this is how much we valued the natural assets we are destroying. This is the amount of income that we are trying to create, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that action has been missed out. And we do need to get to a situation where that is done. Now, going back to the companies thing, I'm frankly fairly scared of asking companies to start to value natural assets, because of the instances that we've already had, where lots of overvaluation gets done. Um, Things are reported in the stock market, or things are reported to the regulator, which get it's very easy to price things very differently if your companies which are non-monitored are doing this. So the only way you can get the companies to be interested in this or to do it properly is if you have a very elaborate monitoring system, which I think will take a long time to put together. It really doesn't work so easy. So I do value what Iris, for instance, was mentioning, and I think it will be really great to have that. But I wonder, where do we have these capacities spread, or the abilities to make sure that you do not misuse some of these tools that we might place? But then, if we don't do that, then the question is, okay, fine, then what do we do? So I think the first thing that all companies have to do and should be doing and should have been doing by now is to report a very clean and a proper reporting of what has been on various different dimensions, their actions on the environment and also their impact on the environment. It's not something which I think any sensible firm should have been doing. And I don't see why you even need a law for that, because some people are calling for a law. Well, yeah, if we have to have a law, let's just go ahead and mandate it. But, that's something as a first step. Let's start to do that.
Very, very comprehensively summarized. And you have clubbed, you have answered two of my questions that I already have had for you. So we have covered that aspect of what kind of current policy changes need to be there in place, and as you mentioned of mandating the law by law or by to the businesses to follow these laws and comply with the government regulations. I'll come back to the concluding remarks, but before that I want to have Paul talk about the importance of a novel concept like rewilding, in the especially in context of a developing economy like India. I know from the works you have done and a little bit of what I read from your website. Uh, could you throw some light on the concept of rewilding and how it can help India have a more ecologically sensitive development approach?
Yeah, thanks. Well, I mean, rewilding really goes back to that earlier point I made about the, if you like, the expansion of the concept of biodiversity to ecosystem recovery. And in many ways, rewilding just reflects or expresses advances in ecological science or better understandings of ecosystems, and particularly past ecosystems. But it also expresses a new and hopeful environmental narrative. It's really about just let's get going, accept where we are and look for opportunities to recover nature. And really it goes back to that point I was making about innovation. We can just understand rewilding as spaces of innovation, both in ecological thinking, in conservation finance, and also practical applications, demonstration projects of it. So I think for me the value of rewilding is that sort of unsettling, that shaking up, that refresh of how we think about relationships between nature, society, and economy, and that's expressed in different places in different areas of the world and in different contexts. So I think for India and really for any country, it's just rewilding is just a new way of thinking, a refresh, a reset, and a revitalization on it. But perhaps I could just go back to a couple of the points where the discussion has been on, because I really take Lavesh's point about this sort of need for sort of guidance or policy, and it doesn't necessarily need to be changing laws at the top. In the UK, since we left the European Union, we've had a really big refresh on this, and part of this came out with an environment strategy. And environment plans or strategies can be done at any level of tiers. And within that, we adopted the natural capital approach. So it was this really clear steer to planners, to businesses, that the government was going to integrate a natural capital approach. And that's come through into spatial planning. So now you have to do a natural capital ecosystem service plan in spatial planning. So you get it into multifunctional, cost benefit decision making. It's also steered in terms of being integrated into our natural planning framework, the principle of 10% biodiversity net gain. And this has created a really strong steer from government, if you like, which I think, Laveesh, as you said, that businesses, bureaucrats, they respond, and all of us respond to those steers. So I think there is scope. I don't quite know the Indian bureaucrat. I know a bit about it. I think there is scope to do things ahead of law changing in law. And then perhaps just picking up on the discussion we've had of businesses, I think something else the communities I've been involved in have been very attentive to is that businesses are run by people. Like, they're just like you, me. They have, they're not necessarily bad. They're just doing what they think is better on it. But for us, one of the key needs here is really improvements in spatial intelligence. And this is what we call early engagement. If we can understand where, businesses have got licenses, where they're starting to, to think about doing whatever they're doing. Getting in early is really important, and having those conversations early is really important, because as soon as deals are done, political deals, commercial deals, as soon as capital is invested, capital is sunk, it's really hard to change things. So this idea of getting ahead of the curve with spatial intelligence is really important, and WWF has invested in this. And you can sort of mash this up from different areas. You can look at the satellite stuff, you can bring in databases of licenses and so forth. And that really, for me, is an investment of civil society getting together, perhaps with some of the rating agencies as well in the finance world, because they are looking for data beyond reports now, of asset level data, and just getting ahead of the game and having those conversations with business leaders early. So we, as Iris was saying, we can talk about the natural capital framework before they've already made these sometimes, disastrous decisions for the environment. And we are seeing really good developments in this technology side. I mean, you may know that there's quite a lot of natural languaging processing where you're just scraping newspaper reports and seeing where controversies are happening and making those visible to the public. So I'm a big, advocate of investing in spatial intelligence as well, in that technology, because at the end of the day, we're dealing with a system here. We're trying to transition or transform the system, and we've just got to hit it from lots of, work from lots of different directions, but also appreciate that technology is shaping the world. And if we can align recovering forces of nature, or the force of nature, with technology and society, maybe that's where some of the gains or opportunities lie.
I think we all agree with the fact that technology will play an important role and is playing an important role when it comes to designing our development paradigms, as in trying to bring as much welfare to the humans and the planet as a whole. I would so continuing with the question of laws, policies, and also initiatives from civil societies as well as the government. My last question, and this is to all of our panelists. The outbreak of COVID-19 is a critical juncture in human history, right? Can you give us a couple of points on what kind of reforms should we undertake in our existing laws, policies, and frameworks, so that more public money can be directed towards a balanced human and natural welfare?
Sure. Also wanted to reflect a bit on the points of Lavish and Paul. I think what Paul said, just to have that spatial understand sort of the natural stock in a region. I think that's just really important to understand what value do you have there. And I think for governments and also what was discussed before, we do not always have to look at new laws, but I think these sector dialogues, or like the dialogues with businesses, between governments and businesses, is really important also for providing that direction, what Lavish was talking about. And so then together, you also try to understand what is that value that we have here? How can we make use of that value, and also make sure that we can further optimize that value, so that therefore optimizing the value of nature, of business, of society. But I think through these sector dialogues, then it's a sort of a learning process from both sides, the government, also businesses, and businesses can in that process, for instance, also say that we would like to go to that level, but this law or this kind of regulation is currently preventing us to move towards different practices. So that's what I would say, like really have the dialogue between governments, between businesses. And I think also then that greenwashing would also not be that great of an issue as we have now, because on both sides you try to understand better what's best for the country as a whole. And I think, governments, of course, have tools to motivate nature positive decisions. They can indeed subsidize certain projects. They can indeed focus more on investing in innovation, as Paul is emphasizing quite a lot. And indeed, for the financial sector, going beyond removing harm. That's also what Paul said. Like, we really have to go towards how can we make a positive contribution, how to move towards a positive contribution. How does that look like? And again, then that engagement trajectory, I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but the financial sector, they have these engagement trajectories with companies to really together understand how to move forward on certain topics. And I think also that engagement trajectory is a trajectory of learning. It's a trajectory of learning for the investor and for the company itself. And having these overviews of best practices really help also bring in for these to improve these engagement conversations between investors and businesses. So if you know about good practices within certain sectors, you can really steer that conversation with these companies to move towards a better result. It's all about engaging, about dialogue, about bringing parties together.
Yeah, but so Dr. Lavish, like one of the problems here is that although the engagements keep happening, there is a constant dialogue happening. But a lot of times what also happens is that businesses get away with uh, unsustainable practices, and there is no accountability, right? Neither to the government nor to these businesses. So how do we also ensure that the accountability exists so that there are no ill effects of whatever businesses practices are being followed?
Thanks, Ankit. I'd like to just start with the point that I was making initially, and I'll just repeat that. It's a problem. Businesses get away because of a capacity problem. The capacities in India are just not there to be able to monitor and to enforce some of the laws that already exist. So when we say that businesses get away, essentially many of them they're not in the radar at all. Now, it may not necessarily be a failure it may not be an issue of corruption, though some people believe that is so. It's essentially just the fact that the whole state is right now not built to look at environmental issues. It has been for the last 7 decades been built to look at what we used to call economic progress. Build more, have more roads, build more dams, build more canals. And suddenly we are saying, hey, wait a minute, a road is not necessarily the most important thing. You can't just go ahead and build dams blindly, and so on and so forth. That those capacities and that understanding, that depth of understanding, and it requires both skills as well as an instinct, will take some time, but we have to start now. We don't start now, we are essentially on a path of complete disaster. So it is essential to do that. It's not that we must do that. We can't not do this, right? And that is to build the kind of capacities in the state itself. That's and I'll go to the point that Paul was making about innovation. That's another one must. Under the current set of technologies that we have access to, if you put, and we have, let us say, however many 100 million people yet to come by let's say about 2050, 2060, we'll have somewhere between, depending upon the estimate, somewhere around 300 million more people. And we have about 1 billion people whose incomes definitely need to increase, perhaps double, perhaps triple. Put it all together, forget about an environment disaster. We are going to completely annihilate a lot of the natural capital that we have, right? Now, without those innovations, we will not be able to do it. Those innovations are critical for us. And it's across all domains. It's across agriculture, across, of course, manufactured items, across services, etc., etc. So innovation, as Paul said, is actually the key. And whatever works there, we have to do that. But thankfully, India is among the world's largest startup hubs today. I mean, it's not just in Bangalore. You have in small tier 2, tier 3 cities, we are seeing people coming together and having a bulk of startups. So I think it's not that we can't do it, but we really have to act on it fast.
And what role can civil society especially play in that, pushing for these reforms?
I think a lot of the civil society in India, especially, has really not educated itself. I mean, I'll give you an example. We keep on talking about that how the government must do A, B, and C, but they do not engage into how the government can go about doing it without harming the environment. And so and just this one example I'll give. The civil society has been pushing for a lot for, let us say, improving Delhi's air pollution. Okay, something which now we feel perhaps is never going to change, right? But when the government comes up with a solution, the civil society really doesn't know, because it really doesn't have itself the capacity to be able to understand whether those solutions are right or not. So the government got no support when it went in for some sort of, let's say, the changes in the farm laws from civil society, right? And some of those farm laws were actually meant to improve the environment, right? So the civil society itself has to educate itself and be selective in its opposition to some of the government policies.
Thank you, Dr. Lavish. So, Paul, I would like your remark on the same question of first of accountability, as in how can we have more accountability for the businesses and the governments so that they don't get away with unsustainable practices, and then also adding on to that what Dr. Lavish mentioned of civil society not being educated itself, like uh, not understanding itself the concepts in the micros. So how can we also look towards building these capacities?
Yeah, thanks. And perhaps I could pick up on your earlier point, Ankit, about policy changes. So I'm going to. One of the areas I'm quite interested in is actually educational policy and the role that educational policy might have here. And forgive me if India is already doing this, maybe, but in the UK now, we're starting to change our PhD programs. We're starting to add another year to them. So they used to be 3 years, they're now 4 years and what have you. And the same with MSc programs, extending them up a little bit. And that's to give space and promote and encourage industrial placements within them. So as part of a doctorate or a higher degree now, there is an encouragement, it's not a requirement yet, but this could be it, to do an industrial placement. And that industrial placement could be with government, it could be business, or it could be with civil society. Now, I see this as a really positive opportunity to address some of the things we're talking about, because, of course, there's a two-way flow of knowledge, but we've got, your point, Laveesh, about civil society not being able to assess things or whatever. You have that flow of talent and actually the flow of new values going into businesses or governments very early on, and creating that dynamic with really the generation who are going to shape the future. So sometimes I do wonder whether, I mean, that's not simple, but something just as if you like, nuanced as that, of actually changing the way we or the framework for acquiring a doctorate or acquiring a higher level education thing, and there has to be an engagement with that real world, and academia is having a stake in it and interfacing with it and an interplay with it. Maybe that's something which can be done on it. And of course, from the business side, they're going to love the idea of industrial placements because they get first look at talent, basically. But that talent will also challenge them as well.
Yeah, thank you so much, Paul, for those insights. So before closing off the session, I would ask all our panelists to give out at least a couple of quick pointers on how can we mainstream the valuation of natural assets within our economic and environmental policies.
That's what I thought. Yeah, I think it comes back to all the discussions we had. Mainstream, I think, in order to mainstream, it needs to be a collaborative effort. Otherwise, I think it will be very difficult to make it mainstream. What I was just discussing before, for example, the capitals approach, natural capital thinking, social capital thinking, has been a way to mainstream that more across businesses, across governments and society. So yeah, I think it just comes back again to just collaboration, dialogues, and be very clear about the direction we are heading to, and that provides value actually to all of us.
Yeah, thank you, Aris. Dr. Lavish?
So I'd start with what the UK did. I mean, there needs to be a national report on valuation of natural capital. Yeah. I think that was such an important It was a path-breaking exercise in the part of the UK government to actually have done that. And it's actually given an example to the rest of the world. And it's strange that we haven't followed up on that. So I think that's the first step. And the second is I would do what Iris just has already mentioned about let's start talking. I mean, I think a lot of engagement, just pure engagement, can achieve quite a bit.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lavish. Paul, your remarks.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I do, picking up on what Laveesh said, I do think that our natural capital accounting was good. And actually, Scotland now has a natural capital index, which can, it's one of these national level barometers. So that is a good thing. I think when we're talking about valuing natural capital, I mean, it's easy sometimes that you want to put a price on it. So you say value equals price. And the trouble with that is you can just flatten the social values of it. And this isn't really a recommended answer, but we're thinking quite a lot about how you can create storified value and increasingly the value of stories in society. And again, technology enables that. And how storified value from natural assets can become material both to investors and to companies.
Thank you so much, Paul. And thank you all of you for the productive session and the dialogue we have had. And it was very informative. We'll take away a lot of key points from here and try to incorporate it within our work, as well as try to promote whatever we have learned from all of your experiences. Thank you for your time and for joining us and sparing some time to put on your insights on this session. Looking forward to having more such sessions with you. I can't see any questions. Otherwise, I would have asked a few questions to you. Is there? No questions. There are no questions for us right now.
Thank you, Ankit. That was very nice. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation. Thanks for
Thank you.
lovely discussion. Yeah.
And thanks for moderating.
Yeah.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you.